and welcome to Interpreting India's first episode in the new year. This season, we at Carnegie India are examining many of the challenges and opportunities that India will confront in this decade. I'm your host, Suyash Rai, and this week we are discussing the rise and fall of India's economic growth. The pandemic has been very costly for the Indian economy, delaying India's journey to prosperity by at least 2 years. But lest we forget, India's economy was not in a good shape even before the pandemic hit. The official GDP estimates show a sharp slowdown since 2017, and investments and exports, the two major drivers of growth, have been sluggish through much of the decade preceding the pandemic. To help us understand India's growth story, we have with us Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Dr. Subramanian is a former chief economic advisor to the Government of India, having served between 2014 and 2018. He is currently a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at the Brown University. He's a widely cited expert on economics of India and China and the changing balance of global economic power. Dr. Subramanian, welcome to Interpreting India.
Glad to be on the show, Suyash.
Sir, our conversation today is about rise and fall of India's economic growth. And I thought it would be fitting to start with talking about how we measure India's GDP and its growth. And you have also been an important contributor to the debates around the new series that was launched in 2015 when the base year was changed to 2011-12. And since the series was launched, there were many critical inputs into the validity of the series. And about 2 years ago, you contributed to this debate by writing a couple of papers in which you basically tried to validate the estimates. And you argued that because the correlation between the change in GDP and the change in some of the other economic indicators had broken down in the new series compared to the previous series, it seemed that the GDP estimates didn't quite pass the test of validation and they needed further work. Now, since then, two things I noticed at least that one is that the sharpness of the decline in GDP growth has been captured to some extent. One could disagree on the levels. The other is the pandemic shock. At least when I look at different variables that you had looked at in your paper, prima facie, it seems that the national accounts do capture, at least to a substantial extent, what intuitively we see going on in the economy. That like the first quarter of lockdown, there was a 25% decline in real terms in economic output. Perhaps the underlying database has become more stabilized and improved the quality. Perhaps CSO is taking into account some of the critical inputs and improving. Do you think there's a case to be made that the quality of estimates may have improved in the last couple of years?
It's worth stepping back and, at the risk of getting a little bit too detailed and complicated, but it's a podcast for nerds in any case. So let's kind of indulge a little bit. Look, I think one has to distinguish, I would say, two or three, periods of the data revisions. So the first set of data revisions about which I wrote was, when the data changed, methodology changed 2015. So from 2011-12, we had new numbers. And my original work was from the period 2011-12 to about 2017-18. Yeah. And there, as you quite rightly said, while others focused on, data quality, data input, deflators, all this stuff, I took a slightly different tack and said, look, I don't want to get into all the weeds of the methodology, but can it be validated by looking at other major macro indicators, like exports, credit, imports, trade, capital goods, IIP consumption, so a bunch of profits, a bunch of other major macro indicators, which also we think proxy the macro economy. And there, what I found very simply that correlation between GDP and those indicators, which was there before the change, kind of broke down after the change. And it was really striking how the decoupling happened. Just to give you an example, I think exports declined by something like 13 percentage points on average. Investment declined by about 15 percentage point on average in the post 2011-12 period. And yet all these declined massively. And yet GDP was actually either steady or slightly increasing. So that's phase one of the data. And I believe that was largely a technical problem, or at least I have confidence or like to believe that that was a technical problem. But then what happened? There's a second set of data revisions that happened, which is, the data from 2045 to 1112, the backcasting, that got changed. And this has kind of gone under the radar. And there what happened was that the GDP numbers were revised downwards. And there I feel that downward revision also was kind of quite problematic. And in a recent presentation, I showed that, the implication of the downward revision for GDP going back, led to a forced revision of consumption, which just seemed completely implausible. So that's the second phase. That part, I cannot say, I don't know enough, but I can't say with any confidence that that was purely a technical problem in a way that I could say about the post 2011-12. Then there's a third period, which is 2019-20, where you're right that it did show a deceleration, but I feel that that deceleration was plausible enough for people to take their eyes off the level. Because if you look at 2019-20, Suyash, the GDP growth was 4%, and every other major macro indicator is either in negative or deeply negative territory. So now you might say, all that matters is the trend and not the level. But to me, there the level matters for a very important economic reason, because it explains to me why the shock of the pandemic was the maximum in India. After all, it was the same pandemic all over the world, but the decline in Indian activity in the first year of the pandemic was the biggest in the world. I think along with the UK, a downward revision about 11 percentage points. Now, why did that happen? Part of it was because of lockdown, I think. But I think if you look at the numbers, our fiscal response was kind of median. So that couldn't explain it. It seems to me, therefore, that another candidate is that actually even before we headed into the pandemic, the economy was, actually had shrunk. So COVID was a shock that hit an already very weak economy. And that weakness was not captured enough by the deceleration. In fact, it can only be captured by a collapse in economic activity. Now, post-pandemic, I think you're right. I think, the macro indicators seem to be tracking the GDP. And I just haven't done enough to have a strong view. But prima facie, it seems that, the pandemic is GDP has tracked it. So we just have to wait and see going forward, how these things track each other going forward.
Right. Now, I want to take a step back and talk about something that you've written extensively about, is the slowdown that preceded the pandemic. In the 90s and 2000s, broadly, India was seeing rapid growth. There were a few years of slowdown during the Asian financial crisis. There were major droughts in the early 2000s, then global financial crisis. But we were seeing rapid growth in most of the years. In fact, our growth was about the same as the Chinese growth around that time. So what was the main kind of point at which the story turned, and why did that happen?
Yeah. So I think, Suyash, I think in a sense, I think Josh Feldman and I are more and more convinced that really the slowdown began around 2011-12 after the global financial crisis. And you see, it happened for a lot of reasons. Firstly, of course, the excesses of the boom, as it were, left a large legacy, which Josh and I have called the twin balance sheet problem. And that's why you see, basically after 2011-12, credit growth and investment growth have completely kind of collapsed. And also the world economy turned, so exports also collapsed. So those two big engines of growth, investment and exports, partly related to what we call the twin balance sheet, partly to the downturn in the world economy. So those two engines collapsed. And of course, we know what happened. In the second UPA2, we had, major problems. We had an inappropriate fiscal response. We had policy paralysis. We had corruption. We had, all the Vodafone and the, very anti-market, anti-thing, policy actions. So I think that began the slowdown, along with the overhang of the excesses from the lending and investment boom. So we had a twin balance sheet problem. World exports declined. Government policy response started deteriorating very rapidly, beginning in UPA2. And then, of course, that legacy kind of persisted. And, since 2014-15, some things were done, some things were not done. So that weakness kind of continued. There were other shocks like demonetization, GST, which kind of also things. But then on the other hand, there were other reforms were done. So kind of basically, it's a story more broadly of, the two big engines, long-term engines of growth collapsing, combined with, a policy response that was either, kind of completely inappropriate, or in some cases inadequate. I mean, we still haven't, for 10 years, for example, we couldn't really solve the twin balance sheet problem. So, investment and credit remained weak for a very, very long time. And of course, exports only now are picking up. We had very weak exports. So, policy could not reverse the challenges of the fading away of the two big engines of growth. Remember, from 1990 to about 2012, the two people forget that the two engines that drove growth were investment and exports and trade more broadly. And those two engines collapsed after 2011-12. So in a sense, we've had a kind of lost decade of weak, I would say fairly weak, not absent growth, but fairly weak, tepid growth thereafter.
I want to unpack this a little bit about the twin balance sheet problem. So the way I see it is that initially there was some forbearance in recognizing the depth of the problem. But by around 2015, the asset quality review had been done, and substantially, at least the bad debts had come out into the open. Now, since then, it's been now for several years. What do you think are the main factors because of which we have not been able to address this? And
Yeah. So, Suyash, remember that I think, to be fair, I think the asset quality review revealed for the first time the magnitude of the problem, right? Then, of course, there were all these discussions about whether we should do bad bank or not. So there was no real policy response. The transparency happened. Remember, I have this, fivefold, in order to solve a twin balance sheet problem, I used to say that we need, the 5 R's, right? We need recognition, resolution, reform, I forget what the other two are, but basically, first you need to recognize the problem, and then you need to address it through, cleaning up both the firm and resolution, exactly. Resolution. Now, in terms of resolution, the first real thing was, in fact, the IBC. The resolution only happened beginning in 2018, if you recall. The famous circular was issued. Some initial things were sent to IBC. But then soon after, even that came to a standstill, essentially. And so, in terms of actual action, the resolution part of it, you've had really very little. And now even that has kind of, the IBC is in limbo. We now have a bad bank. We don't know what's happening really. So in some ways, if you step back and look at it, we really haven't, despite some efforts, haven't really come to grips with, the twin balance sheet challenge. But of course, lo and behold, and this is the irony, Suyasha, lo and behold, we've had 10 years of, really treading water on this problem. The pandemic hits, suddenly profits go up, stock markets boom, both firm balance sheets improve, and NPAs come down to some extent also because of the recapitalization and things. So in a sense, the irony is that 10 years later, the problem seems to be better, but not because of any serious policy action, because the irony is that you needed a pandemic to cure the twin balance sheet challenge. But that's what seems to have happened, which is really, if you think about it, quite mystifying.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what to make of these numbers, because in a crisis, we tend to delay recognition of the impact. So if forbearance is really going on, the full impact of the pandemic may be seen only with a lag. Is it perhaps too early to say whether the balance sheet problems have really been overcome?
Yeah, so I completely agree, but at least the official numbers are saying that the problem is better. See, by the way, even the current numbers, the levels are still high. The NPAs are in the public sector banks are still more than double digit, if I'm not wrong. So the levels are still reasonably high, and as you quite rightly said, we don't know what the aftermath of the pandemic is, because remember that both the SME sector has encountered three shocks in 4 5 years. Demonetization, GST, and a pandemic, which have disproportionately affected the SMEs. And we also know that consumer balance sheets have also been affected, because we know labor market, employment, incomes have been very badly affected. So I think we should allow for the possibility that maybe the NPA problem is maybe actually slightly worse, and as you quite rightly said, that will only become evident in a few years.
Right, right. Now, I want to spend some time with you talking about the onshore regime, in some sense. The period of the 90s and the 2000s, where India's growth accelerated and then accelerated again.
Yeah.
If you took look at the narratives on political economy today, that period is considered to be, especially the 2000s, are often considered to be periods of excesses, and in some ways, the political economy order is being remade in a response to uh, that order. If I'm not reading too much into it, so I want to test a few, of these narratives with you and take your perspective on them. So one part of the strand of the narrative is that that old order was corrupt, and there was considerable corruption that drove the processes that ultimately created growth. And you just a few minutes back said that the growth was primarily led by investments and exports. And if I look at exports, quite a few of the exports are in complex products. Even the less complex products that we export, like petroleum and diamonds and all of those, are all not the types of products that we have the raw material for. We import and then add value and export. Similarly, on investments, largely were private investments. Now, but the narrative is about resource raj, plutocracy. There's a certain stigma attached, and you called it stigmatized capitalism. The question I want to pose to you is that is the tag of stigmatized capitalism built on actual material facts, or is it more of a construction of a political contestation where one side is trying to uh, you know basically delegitimize the other side by saying that you were doing too much corruption at that time? Or can we disaggregate the story and say, okay, this is the part where the stigma is legitimate, and there are other things that were going on that were not of that type? So, how do you see the big picture?
Yeah, so I think it's a great way of framing this, Suyash. But firstly, Suyash, I would insist that India has had 3 decades of 2 decades of rapid growth and 1 decade of very rapid growth. So, you see, remember the disagreement between Danny Roderick and me and the rest of or the rest of the crowd is not about whether the 80s was rapid growth or not. Everyone acknowledges that in the 80s it grew at 6. There was a takeoff. The only question is whether it was sustainable, etc., etc. So we've had 3 decades of very rapid growth: 80s, 90s, 2010, and then then the deceleration. So the question is, we have to understand what kind of growth did we have before. As you rightly said, the 90s and 2000s certainly, I would say, let me be provocative here, was very much an East Asian model of growth driven by investment and exports. Except that, and this is what Soumitra Chatterjee and I wrote, except that those were not comparative advantage based exports in terms of, textiles, clothing, unskilled, relatively less skilled, but it was based on high skilled, as you rightly said, not just in services, but also in manufacturing. So our manufacturing exports were very much tech intensive, high skill intensive, etc. That is why, of course, what happened was, unlike in East Asia, the spread of the benefits of growth were less than they were in East Asia. And that's what I think has fed a little bit into this. Oh, this neoliberal paradigm is not good. Therefore, we need to change it drastically, etc., etc. And maybe there is some truth to that. But I do think that we've had a very unique pattern of specialization based on, and there are lots of reasons for that. We can go into it. But now coming to the political economy of this, right? See, I think stigmatized capitalism is not a 2000s phenomenon. It goes back to, our license quota permit Raj. Because remember, the key insight about stigmatized capitalism is that because we had this license quota permit Raj, even the private sector that did well in that era, there was always the whiff of suspicion that it got ahead because of its proximity to government rather than because of being genuinely kind of competitive, well-governed, etc. And, we don't have to name names, but, there are lots of stories of, big capital basically manipulating the license quota Raj, the minutiae of, tariffs and excises to their advantage. So stigmatized capitalism is as old as the license quota permit Raj itself. I think what happened was that in the 90s and early 2000s, there was this brief period when our services sector did well. There was a sense that, we've had a bit of a break with that because this is a sector that's grown not because of its proximity to government and the state, but because of its distance from the state. It's well governed. It's listed on foreign markets. It's internationally competitive. There's no doubt about that. But then we had the 2000s, which kind of made us realize that, that was an aberration because the 2000s were, they were similar to the license quota Raj, and different only to the extent that the form in which this happened was not based on getting licenses and manipulating tariffs and things. It was based on these, what we call the rents, whether it's spectrum, whether it's land, whether it's coal. So the form of stigmatized capitalism changed. The fact of it did not change. And of course, then we had all the banking related stuff as well. But we know that banking has always been politicized. Credit lending has been always politicized. And, both Viral Acharya's book and I think Urjit's book also say that. Then, of course, and here's, I think, the interesting thing. So, you're actually making me think aloud. Stigmatized capitalism phase one was the license quota permit Raj. Then we had the aberration where we thought, we'd kind of conquered it with us or overcome it. But then the 2000s, it became a rents Raj. So stigmatized capitalism still remained the form took. But then what happened was, I think, phase three of stigmatized capitalism. Remember, in phase two, there was something interesting about this, Suyasha. It was not just that the form changed, i.e. land, spectrum. I called it, ethereal rents, which is spectrum, terrestrial rents, land, and subterranean rents, which was coal. So, we had all these kinds of rents. But the other thing, Suyash, was that, stigmatized capitalism phase two was what I would call anarchic stigmatized capitalism. It was an anarchy because there were many givers and many takers. So, everyone was running amok on the giving side, and on the political side, everyone was running amok on the taking side. I think stigmatized capitalism phase three is, again, Suyash, we don't have numbers. This is just speculation. And, but it seems to me that one hypothesis would be that stigmatized capitalism phase three is from anarchic, stigmatized capitalism, it's become a kind of oligopsonistic stigmatized capitalism, where the number of real givers and the number of real takers has been shrunk to kind of a few. I don't want to, get into numbers. And, I call this stigmatized capitalism 2A, the 2A variant. But I think more broadly, it's about anarchic stigmatized capitalism giving way to much more oligopsonistic few givers, few takers. And so here's the interesting thing about it, therefore, Suyasha. I think there are two kind of conceptual, therefore, conclusions we can draw. If what I'm saying is right, then I think you move from what Mansur Olson said, from a roving bandit form of stigmatized capitalism to a stationary bandit. And we know that stationary bandit means actually invest the tax on investment is a little bit less because there's less uncertainty. You could argue that what business cares about most is not whatever bribing, corruption, the level, but the variability and the uncertainty. So once you go to stigmatized capitalism, the oligopsonistic or 2A variant, you go from a roving bandit to a stationary bandit. One, and second, this is very important for the politics of perception. When you have anarchic stigmatized capitalism, everyone thinks it's happening. Because stories are legion, everyone is following. This guy is giving, this guy is taking, and the perception is that this is really rampant. But once you go to oligopsonistic thing, people think it's actually come down. Because, by definition, fewer givers and takers, the perception is, oh my God, all that thing has disappeared. And people don't really focus on the few givers and takers. It's at least not as visible. So the perception of stigmatized capitalism, when you go from roving bandit to stationary bandit, or from, anarchic stigmatized capitalism to A variant, is that the perception changes as if, there's kind of less rent seeking and corruption. Now, whether that's true or not, who can say? We don't know. But certainly the perception changes, and therefore, you can people are willing to play this game and say, look, stigmatized capitalism has gone away. It was there before. It's not there now. But I think it's because the form has changed, the concentration has changed, and therefore the perception has changed.
Yeah, so it makes me think whether we are moving from roving bandit to stationary bandit, or from many stationary bandits to only a few stationary bandits.
But many stationary bandits is more bad than one stationary bandit.
I mean, depends. I mean, it depends on the level at which the deals are being made. So, I mean, if you look at the experience of some of these East Asian countries, obviously in Korea and Japan, it was basically one, because it was highly centralized, smaller countries, very competent bureaucracies making these kind of decisions. But in China, this is much more decentralized. So local stationary bandits who are making these, Shanghai cities making deals with GM, and others are making deals with their own respective contexts.
Can I make a distinction? So I think that when we talk about stationary and roving bandits, we, I think, refer to it over a common policy space. I.e., if they're spatially disaggregated, in every local government, if there's one bandit, that's essentially, basically a stationary bandit model. It's only when over the same space there are multiple bandits or multiple things, then you get these problems of, is investment affected, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a kind of definitional clarification.
Right. So moving on to another theme that has become very common in India in recent years is that earlier the political economy was very accepting of informality and informal employment, enterprise. I mean, low tax base and those kind of realities. And now there's focus on formalizing the economy. So, I mean, by taking a variety of measures, whether it's demonetization, whether it's creating a certain comprehensive model of GST and so on, we want to actively formalize enterprises in India. And usually, I mean, the way one thinks about it in development economics is that structural transformation will happen, and as a consequence, formalization will flow from there in the traditional model. But here it's the other way, with that the assumption is that we formalize and therefore we'll get a certain kind of growth and structural transformation. How do you see this story of the last 5-6 years of emphasizing on formalization as an objective in itself?
Yeah. So I think, Suyash, I agree with almost everything you said, except with one major point of disagreement. Okay. So I think we all know from the development literature that, formalization is kind of endogenous to development. You develop more, you're going to become thing. And therefore, kind of that's the way one should broadly think about formalization. However, I think you're right that, after 2014 and generally even around the world, people started saying, no, we can nudge development itself by accelerating formalization, and therefore we kind of nudge formalization. Okay. Now, I think there are two ways of doing, even if you believed in the causation from formalization to development as opposed to the basic causation from development to formalization, I think there are many ways of doing this. There are kind of punitive, heavy handed ways of doing this. And there are kind of incentive based, voluntary basis ways of doing it. Right. And I would argue that the GST was very much a latter, because the way GST was meant to work in terms of formalization was very simple, right? It was not that anyone forced you to register because the thresholds were recently high, but because big firms would have an incentive to buy from other formal firms in order to get this input tax credit and all of that, that would kind of encourage and incentivize the informal sector to become formal, right? So it was very much a nudge-based, incentive-based, voluntary, based way of doing it, and therefore less heavy-handed, and therefore something that I think was actually desirable. I mean, obviously there are going to be transitional costs, but that was very different from the earlier episode of demonetization, which was a very kind of heavy-handed, using sticks rather than carrots to formalize. And so I think would be for me the distinction to make, that one, yes, mostly the causation flows from development to formalization. Two, however, it's not bad to try and tap the reverse causation. But if you have to do it, you have to do it through nudges and incentives rather than through sticks and heavy-handed methods, because the costs then are very high if you do it through sticks.
So, I mean, I would like to explore this a little further, but in the interest of time, I want to move to the next theme on which I want to get your perspective. This is on this question of self-reliance or Atmanirbharta, which has become a buzzword in the last few years. And again, in some ways, it's kind of a reaction to the old order, where it is argued that we had opened up too soon, too much, and now we need to kind of hunker down, develop our capabilities. And there are different kind of strands that are coming out of it. Of course, protectionism, especially through tariffs. Then there is, of course, fiscal measures which are aimed at increasing domestic production. And there is more recently support for certain large domestic firms, especially in their competition with foreign firms. And it comes through in subtle ways in implicit and explicit policy measures. But as a picture, I mean, given where India is in its terms of economic complexity and the kind of export successes it has had, does this kind of a pivot overall make sense to you? I mean, is there anything to be said about it at all in the big picture sense?
Yeah. So I think, to be fair, Suyash, I think we have to understand what is the kind of deeper basis for this pivot, right? I mean, because after all, policymakers are not stupid. I mean, they have their logic and reasons for doing this. And I think, Soumitra Chatterjee and I wrote a piece. I think it's based on I think two or three things. I think one, I think it's just based on completely misreading the previous 20 years. There's all this thing about, our 90s and 2000s growth was based on consumption. People forget that the 90s and 2000s was based very much on exports and investment. And we've kind of a little bit forgotten that lesson that, it's true that it's not the right kind of exports, but it was very much, as Soumitra and I, we were stunned by the fact that in the 25 years from the 90s to 2016, 17, India had the third fastest manufacturing export growth in the world. So it's like we forgot that we were successful, and so it's partly trade itself that drove our growth, and it's kind of like a forgetting that lesson. Second, I think is, and this is where I think this comes from very high up, and it's kind of the general zeitgeist. It's like the notion that India's success has bred the belief that India is a big market. That's why even today, if you read Andy Mukherjee's piece, for example, which he draws upon the work that Shomitra and I did, people genuinely think that India is a big market, and therefore we can afford to ignore the world. What we've had so many years of growth. This famous demography demand and demography and demand that we have a big population, so on, and I think there, we did this, this estimated the size of the Indian market. It's actually not very big. I think people forget that the Indian market is something like, it's a rough estimate, $500 billion. The world market is 20 trillion. So the notion that, therefore you are big convinces you that you can ignore the world. I think that's kind of the second kind of slight misunderstanding. And of course, third, Suyash, is that when things slow down generally around the world, you tend to think that it's because of trade and foreign competition and so on. So that's the kind of it's almost like a natural corollary of a slowdown and weakness in economic activity, that you get some combination of both the rise of identity politics, and you get the inward turn economically, because after all, the inward turn political and economic are related, and to me that's a lot of it is due to weakness in the economy as well. So three factors: we forgot our experience with dynamic we overstate how big we are, and third, weakness leads to economic and political nationalism, and that's where I think it's coming from.
Now, turning to the specific strategies that seem to be deployed in this pivot, one is, of course, protectionism. So, as you showed in your paper, also the increase in tariffs. Second is this kind of production-linked incentives, not export-linked. So it's really, up to the firm to produce, and the discipline of competitiveness into exports is not quite there in the design of the schemes. And the third is this support for specific firms, which is not a new thing. In the East Asian model also, you see quite a few countries actually supporting certain companies. But I'm reminded of this meeting that General Park used to have, where the targets are usually export related, right? Like, you need to achieve success in the world, not just get a captive market domestically. So in all these three things, do you think enough is being done to ensure that the outcomes are something which cannot be easily gamed in the system?
Yeah, so I think, you raised General Park. By the way, that when he took over, there was a national, I think, holiday called Export Day. I.e., they used to celebrate exports as annually. They would say, how have we done on exports? There used to be General Park announce an export holiday. That's how obsessed they were with exports. But here's, I think, what is common to the industrial and trade policy on the one side, and the promoting of national champions, if I wanted to draw a parallel, is the lack of focus on exports, as you rightly said. But it takes two different forms. And let me explain, and this is important. On the tariffs and the production-linked incentives, it's like, as you said, apart from all the things that associate with government intervention and, bureaucracy, Raj, all of that, the two problems with that are, there is no real discipline on exports, right? And everything encourages import substitution. So that's kind of and with the production linked incentives, you see that most of the incentives have been given to capital and technology intensive sectors, high skill sectors, and not to labor intensive sectors. So in a sense, you're perpetuating that unusual comparative advantage, and there's no discipline on export performance, which is what distinguishes it from Korea. Now, but on the national champion side, Suyash, there I think it's a little bit different and tricky, which is that what is for me very unique about the two A's and the national champions. It's broader than a few groups, but let's just, for the sake of argument, think of it in terms of things. Is one the scope and reach of the national champions that are being promoted is unprecedented. It's kind of, if you look at the sectors it's almost every sector. That was not true for the Korean chaebols or the Zap, by the way. It was, but even more important, and this is the key difference, they are almost all in non-tradable sectors, and that is why, by definition, you cannot have export discipline. That's why it's much more prone to regulatory kind of arbitrage, regulatory kind of favors, because almost by definition you can't test it to the you cannot say, are they being I mean, it's worth paying the price for national champions with the chaebols because they were exporting gangbusters. Here, by definition, if you're in non-tradables, by definition, you can't really think. And on top of that, we know what the consequences for other firms have been because of promoting national champions. You've really created a situation where the investment climate for those who are not in favor, it becomes much more arbitrary and unstable. So the combination of being in non-tradable sectors where there's no, where even if you wanted to, you cannot have this export discipline really, plus the fact that you really drive competition down. It's the combination of these two that so the commonality in all these really the way you phrased it is actually very nice, that you don't have this market test of efficiency and competition that stems from being internationally competitive, although for different reasons. In one case, you design it, it's a tradable sector, but you design it to promote import substitution without any discipline on exports. In the other case, almost by definition, because you operate in non-tradable sectors, that export discipline is absent.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think these points make a lot of sense to me, at least, because looking at what has worked in India's own past and in other countries, I mean, lessons have to be drawn to design the policies. And I'm sure they're thinking about it and trying to improvise as they go along. Now, if you were to kind of, again, you've written about it, but it's good to discuss it on a podcast as well, that these two big problems that we have, a revival of private investment and improving our export performance. What are the kind of key pillars that should be in place? And I read your recent seminar article as well, in which you draw this distinction between hardware and software and the problems of software in Indian policy making. What is the kind of big picture that you have in terms of the key political, economy, and institutional priorities that we need to address to be able to make progress on those fronts?
Suyash, by definition, software is kind of a little bit fuzzy, right? It's both fuzzy and it is also much more difficult to address, right? I mean, and that's why it's software. Hardware is you build stuff and you reap the benefits. But what we mean by software is the broader policy framework and the policy making process itself. Now, give you 3 or 4 examples, right? First, data integrity. We need good data across the board. That's the basis for policy making. If you take the COVID pandemic, India is one of those few countries where, scientists, etc., society at large did not have access to the data. And so by definition, your policy response is not, if you go to Twitter and say monitor what's happening in Omicron in other countries, it's like in real time people are doing research and putting out the results. That's so valuable for policy making. In India, it's like you don't have the data, nobody, maybe something is being done. So I think data integrity, quality is a first pillar. Second, I think is this, the whole question we've discussed about a level playing field, and we've discussed that to some extent. The third, which I feel very strongly, is kind of, inclusive participatory decision making, right? I mean, GST got done for all its flaws. GST was a real tribute to cooperative federalism between the center and the states. But in other areas, like whether it's, farm laws or whether it's, response to the lockdown, it's been very kind of unilateral and done. So once you get into that, the kind of trust between various actors in Indian society, whether it's the state, the federal, the central government and the state governments, trust there. Whether it's between the central government and investors because of not having rule of law and things, or between the state and citizens. When all these things kind of start breaking down, I mean, that's what we mean by software. So it's these slightly fuzzy imponderables, but which are, no less important for creating a climate for investment. One last thing I would say on the Atmanirbharta thing is, there is something that I think we have a real opportunity, Suyasha. I mean, obviously, it would require reversal of policy on, on tariffs and not joining agreements, whatever, all, including the software, of course. But here's, I think, a thought I want to leave with you, right? Soumitra and I said, the first big opportunity that was created for India and indeed for the rest of the world was after the global financial crisis. China was becoming richer, wages were rising. And so, labor intensive activity was leaving China. We said that's about $150 billion, and India got very little of that. Most of that went to Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia and places. But here's the interesting thing. There's a second and a third opportunity that's been created. What are those? In the pandemic, you'll see that Vietnam and now China, they've gone in for the zero COVID policy, which means that their production and export capability has been badly affected. And even today there's a piece in the Financial Times which says Chinese export capability, because if you're going to kind of hunker down on a zero COVID policy, obviously your manufacturing and any kind of contact intensive activity is going to thing. So that creates a kind of second opportunity for countries like India. And of course, the third opportunity is that, Vietnam by definition is too small to handle all the space vacated by China. So there's kind of a pandemic created opportunity, that's a new opportunity that's arisen. And I really think this where India should, maybe kind of little bit reassess its policy, focus much more on these labor intensive activities, woo foreign investors, convince them you have an open environment, get into markets which are going to be important. Because remember, if you want to attract someone, say a footwear or a clothing exporter, he wants to come not to export to produce for the Indian market. He wants to produce for the Chinese market and the Japanese market, the Korean market, and the broader Asian Pacific market, which means that, if you stay away from the agreements, that's going to be an additional disincentive. So I think there we have an opportunity. It requires some a reassessment of policy. It requires a much more, active, government to kind of woo the kind of right kind of investments for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this software has to develop as you go along, right? Because each stage of development has its own demands for the kind of software it requires. I mean, Douglas North used to use a kind of a broad term called adaptive efficiency, which was the ability of societies to basically adjust to the changes that are happening in reality. Whether it's a shock or new kind of institutions or technology is developing, can you adjust or not? And some countries are higher on adaptive efficiency. It's something that you have to keep building up.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is primarily what I guess software is about that you're talking about. So, he used to say, he said it in his Nobel Prize speech also, that development is a long process, and he meant development broadly, not just about economic growth, but also broader development of society, political, social development. And it takes a lot of time. So India's, per capita income, going by the Madison data, is where the American per capita GDP was in the late 19th century. And some of these East Asian countries and some other countries also in Africa and elsewhere have shown that you can rapidly converge, right? Like you can go on a high growth episode, and within a generation you can close a lot of this gap, not all of it, but much of it, the gap, which creates its own social and political challenges. There's a lot of disruption, things fall apart, center cannot hold. So if we could end on kind of a note about how you see India's journey, broader economic development journey, within that situate the kind of economic growth story that we have. and which seems to have kind of suffered a few setbacks in the recent years, which we're trying to revive, and we talked about it a little bit. But in the broader, long process of development, where is India right now, and where should we aspire to be maybe a generation from now?
See, it's a great question, and at the risk of becoming expansive, I think we need to step back, Suyasha. See, if you look back at the sweep of last 200, 300 years, you broadly find two successful models of economic and political, both broader development, right? One was the kind of the West, right? Or the West and Japan to some extent. It was a very steady economic progress and political development that also co-evolved, but slowly. You had the franchise being extended slowly a long time. And, basically the West grew at about 2.5% for 250 years. And that's where they are today, right? And so it's a modest, steady economic growth and political and economic development co-evolving as the franchise gets extended. Then you have the East Asian model, which is really accelerated, abbreviated economic development, very rapid, and a sequence where, economic development comes first, and then political development either follows, in the case of Korea, Taiwan, to some extent Singapore, or doesn't follow at all in the case of China. So these are two kind of broad models of, development. Steady, slow, co-evolving economic and political, abbreviated but sequential, where economic development comes first. Now, India, of course, is a complete outlier. It conforms to neither because, it's trying to do accelerated economic development, but where politically, at least democracy came first. And, it's been trying to do economic development, but always with either the benefit or the burden of democracy, depending on your point of view. So it's a very sui generis model. And that's why I think in the long sweep of history, we have to, make allowance for that fairly unique path of development. Now, in that path has, India succeeded, failed? I think the jury is out, right? I mean, I would argue that that this unique path, while it has delivered some major successes, people have voice, people can vote, people can express themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I think people forget that the bigger achievement of that was, a broad modicum of order, what Huntington would call order, broad, avoiding extreme instability. I'd like to say, rather than saying stability, we avoid income. And so, those were the big achievements. But then, the economic and social achievements have kind of lagged behind. And so Rohit Lamba and I have a piece saying, India is a case of, dynamism with incommensurate development. And clearly the fact of our unique model democracy may have something to do with this as well. And also it may have to do with the fact, which is a point that Devesh Kapoor often makes, that, it's also society. We have this baggage of, caste, religion, all of that stuff, right? So to try and navigate development where, you're committed to democracy, you have this baggage of, historical cleavages arising from the way society is organized. So navigating that path is proving to be difficult. But then, it's very unfair to think, or unrealistic to think, that it would be anything but development. A provocative point I want to make is that, or at least for consideration, is that while democracy has given us a lot, the open question is whether it's also been a burden in some respects, whether it has to do with the fact that we've had to do redistribution very early, whether, the inheritance and democracy meant that, property rights are kind of not quite as sacrosanct as elsewhere. And whether, for example, when we get into policies, exiting from policies is extra difficult because of the kind of, commitment to democracy that we have. I mean, these are all kind of open questions. So I think India is very much a kind of, sui generis model. And, we'll just have to wait and see, history's verdict. But I think it's fair to say that it's been set back a little bit this last decade. And, whatever your criterion, I think it's fair to say on all those criteria, there's been a setback. But I think, the famous phrase of Brodel, right? La longue durée d'histoire. I mean, this is 10 years is nothing in the, broad sweep of history. We'll have to see. Maybe Suyash, when you do this podcast with a more intelligent, more thoughtful economist 25 years down the road, you may have some clearer answers.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that perspective. And I agree with you that we have to chart our own path, this long journey, and it is going to be a long journey. Just one final question to you, sir. If there is one book on economic growth that you would recommend to our listeners, which book would that be?
I see. Can I recommend more than one? I have a whole reading list. Maybe you can direct your listeners to that. I can send you the link to that. You have to. You have to read Jared Diamond. I think there's no doubt about that. You have to read Jared Diamond. I would recommend also, Studwell's book on Asia, which I think is a very good analysis of the East Asian growth experience. I would also recommend, Piketty's Capital and Ideology for a, kind of a broad sweep of the whole issues surrounding, imperialism, inequality, capital, the unequal ownership of capital and stuff. I think that's kind of a really interesting book as well. And another book which I like a lot is Ian Morris's Why the West Rules for Now. I think it has a very interesting discussion of China and the West also. So I think these are all some, I think, very good books on that. I know I'm missing some really important ones, but
we'll share the list on our podcast, and we'll give a link below that. So thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian, for joining us today. It's been a very insightful discussion, and thank you.
Thanks, Suyash, for having me. Thanks for really insightful, thoughtful questions. I think that there were some things that came up new, even in my own thinking as we went along. So thanks for that.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.